ET Now are celebrating our 10th anniversary. And as we look back on the last 10 years, we're also looking forward, which is why I have a very special India development debate today for all of you, where we look at the next 10 years of the India story with a series of conversations with the top experts in their fields. So as we ask, can India become a $7 trillion economy? We speak to Arvind Panagria, the economist who served as the first vice chairman of the Niti Aayog to take us through the challenges for the Indian economy. Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, who has changed the face of biotech in India, talks to us on what the future of Indian industry holds. Mahesh Vyas, the foremost expert on employment, tells us what we need to do to harness our demographic dividend. And psephologist turned politician Yogendra Yadav speaks on the future of Indian politics. But let's begin with the economy. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that for the Indian economy to touch $5 trillion by 2024 is achievable but challenging. The estimates by 2030 range from 7 trillion to 10 trillion. But are these estimates credible? What are the hurdles India must first cross? To speak on this, I'm joined now by Arvind Panagria, former Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog. Mr. Panagria, let me begin by asking you the obvious. What are the opportunities and challenges for the Indian economy in the next 10 years?
The opportunities are absolutely enormous. China was the rising economy of the last 2 decades, let's say, and India ought to be that in the next decade, hopefully for 2 decades. So opportunity is enormous. The challenge I still see is that of economic transformation, which to me means being able to transfer a very large part of the agricultural workforce into industry and services, and also transfer a good proportion of the population or the workforce currently in very, very small enterprises into larger enterprises. I think if we can do that, the rest will follow automatically, because what we call development, urbanization, everything is closely connected to that particular step that we need to take.
Mr. Panagria, the last quarter GVA was at 5.8%. There's a consumption slowdown. There is a sluggishness in private investment. Now, do you think that these issues that we're seeing currently are cyclical, or perhaps they're pointing to a structural issue?
Many ways to look at it, but certainly, it is a short-term phenomenon. And when you say 5.8%, that's really one quarter. So when we are talking of 10 years or even longer, I would not go by what is happening in a specific quarter. If I take the last 5 years, our growth rate has been on average 7.7%. So it has been pretty impressive, and that is a growth momentum we need to maintain, which we can. But I think the real challenge is changing the structure of the economy. And which is what I meant by transformation. And this will require creating jobs for the masses in industry and services, jobs that are productive jobs, jobs that pay good wages. So that is, I think, the real challenge. I would not be so worried about some short-term declines in the growth rates. They may simply reflect also a lot of the structural transformation that is already underway. Now, remember that the GST cleaning of the NPAs, and subsequently we also face some challenges in the NBFC, non-bank finance companies, financial woes as well. So a lot of structural change is happening, and some of the decline in the growth rate may very well reflect that. So I'm not worried about that. I think structural change is important, but we need good jobs, well-paid jobs for the masses in industry and services, and those can come only if we do a number of necessary reforms.
So let's now now delve into those necessary reforms that you refer to and the transformational steps that you've spoken about as well. Now, you and me are speaking at the beginning of a 5-year term where there's been a massive mandate, so there's no question of political will or political ability. What do you think should be the broad roadmap from policymakers and government to make these changes happen?
So I've talked between short-term and long-term reforms, but since we are talking here more about the 10 years or longer, let me go to the long-term reforms that we really need. So one is both actually short-term and long-term, which is very important, on which there is one area I feel in which the present government has taken steps backward, and that is the area of trade. Openness to trade is extremely important. Unless we capture the global markets, there is simply no way to create these good jobs. That has been the history of all successful countries, from Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan to China. Our own, we did not succeed during, let's say, about past 15 years or so without achieving a major export success. Our exports, in 2002 were only 50 billion. This is merchandise exports. I am excluding services. And within 9 years, by 2011, we were exporting 300 billion. So that's a 6-fold increase. It is a phenomenal increase. That is the momentum that needs to return to exports. And that also requires the central bank, namely the Reserve Bank of India, to maintain the exchange rate at a competitive level. We have let this real exchange rate appreciate a good bit in the recent years, and studies show very convincingly that has had a pretty serious detrimental impact on the export performance. So that's one, because the global market is $17 trillion. Our share in it is only 1.7%. We need to compared to China, which has about 12%, we need to raise that to at least 4% in the next decade.
So, Mr. Panagrahi, since we're speaking just before the first union budget of this government's second term, do you think it's imperative that this roadmap is set in the budget and we don't go back to this gradualism or incrementalism that we've seen over the last 5 years in consecutive budgets and in policy making?
The roadmap can be set in the budget or outside the budget. To me, really, that is not the most important thing. To me, the most important thing really is to have a plan in the first year and then systematically implement that. What I have in fact suggested is a separate model, with Professor Venkatesh Kumar of TIS, that what the government ought to do is begin some 6 or 7 separate missions. And in each mission, and these missions are not the typical, project or program based, but in each area of reform, you appoint a mission, give a very senior bureaucrat the charge to implement, attach to that bureaucrat an area expert, and give them a solid team of young professionals. Bring them from outside for 3 years, 4 years, and their mandate of each mission should be to design and implement over the 5-year period a given set of reforms with proper deadlines, with a clear outline, what will get done by which date, and they should have direct access to the Prime Minister. So Prime Minister should, take updates on everything. Likewise, those heading the mission should be able to go and speak to the Prime Minister one-on-one, so that there is no fear on their part of, which ministry is coming in the way, which bureaucrats are not moving fast enough. The Prime Minister ought to be informed. So that's the sort of model I would suggest to follow if one really wants to implement these policy reforms.
I just have to ask you this question, Mr. Panagrahi. This time, one of the biggest debate among economists is about the sanctity of Indian data. Of course, you know what I'm talking about. It's former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramanian's claim that the India growth rate may have been exaggerated. We need to relook at the methodology. What is your take on this issue?
Look, my sense is, my guess is, I have no idea, but my guess is that even Mr. Subramanian really doesn't believe what he is saying. that the growth rate for the years from 11 to 16 or 17 was 4.5%. I just don't think that he could possibly believe that. Nobody would.
Now, I must follow up on this one. What do you mean when you say you think Arvind Subramaniam doesn't believe in what he's saying? Do you think his methodology is flawed?
I will not speculate, but I trust that he's a smart man, and nobody who knows the Indian economy would seriously think that a growth rate during those years has been 4.5%.
Okay. There's one more area that I must touch upon when we're speaking about the Indian economy in the next 10 years, and that is the agricultural sector, which currently employs a large number of Indians, but its contribution to the GDP is relatively less. It's seeing a lot of churn, a lot of strife within. Do you think it's a long-standing problem that successive governments have put off because it's politically sensitive? And can we really afford to keep putting this off for the next 10 years?
See, there is obviously a problem there, meaning, and the problem is one of very, very low income, which has to be shared by a very large population. Agriculture contributes 15% of the GDP, 44% of the workforce is employed in agriculture. Now that means that, the output per worker in agriculture is less than 1/4 of the output in industry and services. And at our current level of development, output per worker in industry and services is not very high either. So 1/4 of that, how far can you go? So it goes back to the problem I have repeatedly stated, that our problem really is too many workers in agriculture able to produce too little output. Now, you could think in terms of raising productivity of agriculture, but the problem in agriculture always is that more output, lower prices. So you don't get enough revenues as a result then. So it is a trap unless you take large part of the workforce out of agriculture. I think in the end, I can't emphasize enough how important that is for the future prosperity of the country.
Absolutely. I must ask you, Mr. Panagria, about the numbers. So, Prime Minister Modi has said that it is possible to take India to a $5 trillion economy in the next 5 years. But there's a challenge. There's some estimates which talk about 7 trillion, even 10 trillion by 2030. Do you have a number or any comment on these estimates?
So, if I remember correctly, we are in 2018 or 18-19. About 2.7 trillion or 2.6 trillion. If we are talking nominal dollars, right, not today's dollars, but the current dollars in 2014. So there is that issue. Remember that, when you say 5 trillion, you're not specifying whether it's in today's dollars or in 2014 dollars. Certainly, 2024 dollars. So certainly in the 2024 dollars, that's a feasible proposition. In nominal terms, we have grown, in nominal dollars, we have grown over 10% per year. It would seem, again, I have not done the numbers to compound, from 2.6 trillion at 10%, what you would be by 2024. But it strikes me that it's not an infeasible proposition.
Well, thank you for speaking to us. That was Arvind Panagria laying out the roadmap. The task is very visible, but there is political will which is required to do it, and that is perhaps something this government has, at least political capability. But it's not just the economy, it's the industry as well. And one of the biggest problems facing Indian industry is one of scale. For example, there are currently only 7 Indian companies in the Fortune 500 list. And a lot of companies typically hit a ceiling fairly quickly in their quest to scale up. The growth of industry as technology changes rapidly is at the core and will be the backbone of the Indian growth story. To speak more on the challenges ahead, I'm joined now by Biocon CMD, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw. Ms. Shaw, thank you for speaking with us here at ET Now. Let me ask you the very simple basic one. What are the big challenges for Indian industry in the next decade?
Well, you can see that, there is a very huge debate and discussion around what India needs to do to become a $5 trillion economy. in the next 5 years. And I think that is a very ambitious but important goal to have. And in that, it is very obvious that what we need to do is to become a large economy based on manufacturing and services, and of course leveraging our very important agroeconomy. Jobs is at the center of all of this. I think exports are going to be extremely important as we develop this particular growth trajectory. And I just think that we need to be cognizant of new economies and new technologies. So if you think about what's happening in terms of the digital revolution, and as we call it, the age of algorithms, I think we really need to focus on developing and shaping new technologies and leveraging new technologies so that it can augment our economy and our GDP growth.
Absolutely. But as I was mentioning in the introduction to this interview, Kiran, one of the issues that Indian industry faces is one of scale, and the problems of scaling up when you're growing. You hit a ceiling fairly easily. What can policymakers do to help out industry?
I have a slightly different point of view. I believe that when we look at job creation in a country like India, yes, we do need to ensure that the small entrepreneurs, the startups, the SMEs need to actually reach a scale which allows them to be viable. It's not necessary that they have to become mega scaled kind of entities. So we need to really focus on viability as opposed to just scaling up into large scale industry. So if you were to look at that aspect, then I think what you really need to make sure is that the cost of capital is something that we really need to look at. Today, the cost of capital in trying to scale up any business is very, very expensive, and it does not lend to making these into viable operations. So I think that cost of capital is extremely important. I think bringing down the operational regulatory requirements is going to be extremely important in making these kind of organizations and companies more efficient. And I certainly believe that reducing corporate tax to below 30% levels is going to be very critical to see more investment in large scale industry. Because today that is not very competitive when you look at it in a global context. The cost of capital, I keep on using that phrase because that is what is going to be our biggest challenge. So if you want to see more investment, and I think there are plenty of opportunities for us to invest in, because India is very underinvested in infrastructure. That itself is a big opportunity. But when the cost of capital is so expensive, you are not going to see private sector investing it in this particular opportunity big time. So we need to look at some of these pain points and remove some of these pain points. Again, if you want Indian exports to be globally competitive, which is what we need to focus on, again, cost of capital has to be much more competitive. And I also believe that we need to make sure we strengthen our exports through various kind of tax incentives. I think, doing away with SEZs and doing away with many of the export incentives at this stage is very premature. I think we need to be a much bigger and larger export economy, and in order to do that, you will have to continue giving some of these tax sops.
No, absolutely. On the other hand, let's talk about what industry is facing right now. You talked about a credit choke in part due to the NBFC crisis and the clogged up credit system. There's a slowdown in consumption demand. Do you see this as a short-term pain or long-term pain points?
If you look at it, it's a vicious cycle, but they're all connected to cost of capital. If you think about it, why has consumption come down? Because, the consumption has come down because Again, access to capital and the cost of capital for even a consumer is quite high. You know, today buying a car, buying a home, buying anything that you really can sort of, add to economic growth or development is very expensive. So you need to address that aspect of cost of capital for the common man. Because if you can actually boost that domestic consumption by lowering the cost of many of these, many of these sectors, I think you will see a improvement in domestic consumption. Then I think you also need to look at sectors in terms of viability by not having a top-down approach and a unilateral policy where you are not taking into consideration viability aspects. For instance, healthcare. Healthcare is a huge opportunity for India. In fact, exports is obviously become a very big success story for Indian pharma and Indian industry. But then when you look at the size of the healthcare industry in India, it has no correlation to the global presence that we have in healthcare. Because again, we've made it very unviable as a sector by imposing these price controls and price control mechanisms. Even I believe that the Ayushman Bharat scheme is making hospitals and other aspects of healthcare delivery very, very unviable. So I really believe that these are some of the things that really need to be worked on.
So Kiran, we're speaking on the eve of the next budget, and I just must ask you what the government can do at this point as it starts its sort of second innings in this term, and how a framework can be laid out for the next 10 years, including for industry.
So let's be very honest and fair about what we are dealing with at the present time. Yes, we do have a very, very challenged economy because we are still very dependent on an agrarian economy which is simply not sustainable in terms of what we aspire for. And I think we need to bring in technology into agriculture if it is to be absolutely dealt with in an effective way. So I think the government does need to focus on agri reforms in a much bigger way. I personally believe the government would have to look at bringing in incentives for agri cooperatives. See, right now I think we are really dealing with the challenges of very inefficient agricultural models which are based on small land holdings, improper cultivation, and very poor use of technology. So I think you do need to get into much bigger sort of agricultural cooperative farming models and FPO models, I personally believe, to really get out of this abyss that we've got into in terms of agri economy. Then you get into this huge challenge that we have of really the availability of water. You know, when you talk about agriculture, again, there's a huge challenge that we have in water resources. So I would like to see a lot of investment in seeing how we can, revive the water resources of this country, because without that, again, we are going to be doomed. The third thing is, of course, industry as a whole. What are the opportunities within industry? And again, I go back to the fact that we are getting into a digital economy. Do we have enough reforms that actually can unleash the potential of a digital economy? I think that is something that will require a lot of bold reforms, which at the moment are not there.
We hope to see some in this next budget on the 5th of July. Thank you so much, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, for speaking with me. One of the biggest challenges and opportunities for India is going to be the explosion in our population. We're pipped to overtake China within the next 10 years. How can we ensure this remains a demographic dividend and not a disaster? That conversation with Mahesh Vyas coming up next. We're also going to be talking politics. What's the political landscape looking like in the next 10 years? We would be done with another 2 general elections by then. Yogendra Yadav will join me for that. Stay tuned. We're looking ahead to the next 10 years for India today. If you're wondering why, it's because we turned 10 and we like to look forward. Helping us gaze into that crystal ball are a host of experts. And now let's come to a very, very important topic. Estimates are that by 2028, India will overtake China as the most populous nation of the world. Our huge population is considered a boon because most of it, that's about 62%, is in the working age. That's between 16 and 59. This is called a demographic dividend and is an untapped powerhouse. But how do we ensure this doesn't turn into a disaster? To speak on this, I'm joined now by Mahesh Vyas, MD and CEO for the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy and the foremost expert on unemployment. Mr. Vyas, which is why I ask you today that how do we make sure this demographic dividend stays one in the context of finding employment for this large working population?
Well, you know, the demographic dividend window is a limited window. It's not like you will have a demographic dividend forever. And best estimates tell us that the window is open till 2030. And this has been open for a very long time now. And at least the past tells us that we have had no strategy towards exploiting this demographic dividend. And in its last lap, in the last decade, it's a little too late for India to now think about exploiting, deploying, utilizing this great opportunity which comes only once in a lifetime. So I think it's a little late in the day, but we shouldn't give up. Even now we should try our best to make the best of the demographic dividend that we have for a short while now.
Yeah, so what do we do to make the best of this? What should policy makers do? What can we do as a nation? What should individuals do?
This is not something that individuals can look at. Individuals are all there. They're standing out there trying to make the best of the times. An individual cannot see a demographic dividend. A business enterprise, maybe yes, but it is essentially for society as a whole, as large, for the government essentially, to think of how we are going to utilize this big bulge in the demographic distribution that we are getting. If the country is going to have a lot more young working age people, then we have to think of how do we deploy them, and even worry what will happen if we do not deploy them. So this is about creating employment which can harness these people, generate the incomes and prosper thereby. Many countries in history have prospered because of the growth in their population. And if we miss this opportunity, it's going to be a sad thing.
So let's talk about a very specific problem we have. A large part of our working population works in the field of agriculture, where in this sector the contribution to the GDP is relatively less. The plan so far for decades has been to move a lot of these people to manufacturing jobs. Do you think this is still a relevant plan for the next decade? Do you think it needs a rethink?
There's a need to think about this. I don't think there is any rethink because we haven't applied ourselves enough on that. And we should also correct ourselves to say that most of our people work in agriculture. They do not work in agriculture, they remain in agriculture because there's no other place to go to. And therefore, they are counted as working in agriculture. So if you have nothing to do, you sit in your farm and you can always push a shovel or so and say you're working in agriculture. So it's not even that they are working, they are not productive over there, they're just an overhead in our estimation of what comes out of agriculture. So there's a need to seriously think and put into action quickly an increase in manufacturing, an increase in industrial sector to deploy these people on a sustained basis. So, things like building roads, building infrastructure is very short term. You can deploy the people till the road is built. What happens afterwards? After some time, you will have built enough of those roads and then they will all be unemployed. So we built a lot of power plants, for example. We don't need to build any more power plants.
Yeah.
So there is a limit to this. What is required is manufacturing sector, garments, leathers, steel, all of these need to be built on a sustained basis so our consumption goes up.
So the formula by this government to tackle unemployment or underemployment has also been self-employment, which is lets a lot of people start businesses and employ others, in fact. Do you think this could work as a solution to the jobs problem or the unemployment problem we see?
There is no harm in motivating people to become entrepreneurs. We do require entrepreneurs. But that's not a solution. Motivating people to become entrepreneurs is one thing, but saying that that is a solution to employment, that's grossly incorrect. Everyone cannot become an entrepreneur. Everyone cannot give jobs to others. So that's not a strategy. It certainly can be a nice way to put things across to people, but just think of this. When a young person comes out of college, he is barely ready to join industry. So industry tells us that the people who step out of college are not educated and skilled enough to be employed. If that is the case, how can they become employers? So it's very difficult to make people job ready. If that is the case, it's next to impossible to get them to become employer ready. So I don't think that's a strategy at all.
Okay, so in this you have focused on the importance of skilling and saying that there aren't enough skilled workers. There have been innumerable schemes in this government, the last one, the one before that, to skill people. It doesn't seem to be working. What do you think can be fixed here when we talk about tackling the demographic dividend?
No, I think what we have done for skilling so far is clearly inadequate, and skilled people of the kind that we do skilling for are even looked down upon. So to skill people who are not educated is to create second-class citizens. It would be much better if we revamped our entire education system, which is better tuned towards building a strong manufacturing sector. Our education system is more tuned towards creating white-collar workers, and less people who are motivated, skilled, and interested in building factories and growing factories, building efficiencies over there. So that is the requirement of our entire education system. If our engineers mostly go to MBA schools, we are missing out on engineers.
What about automation? We are seeing an increasing amount of automation in manufacturing, and how do we bring this into the entire picture?
That's okay. So we require even more factories. It's not less factories. We require a lot more factories, and India has got the natural resources, it's got the markets, it's got the human resources. We just need to make all of them work together and not be afraid of automation as a starting point. That's being defeatist. So I would say it will be good to get down to industrialization more aggressively.
Well, let's speak here about jobs of the future. As the role of technology grows even further, do you think we need to adequately start thinking about what jobs will be relevant in the future as we look at the next 10 years?
See, it's a little more difficult to imagine that these are big changes. It's difficult to find out what will be the net impact about this. I grew up in an era where we were given a story to be petrified of computerization. That almost will sound odd and funny to a millennial. What is to be feared of computerization? So I'll go by that experience of mine. And I'll say that technology on a net basis is going to be beneficial to us and is unlikely to be completely detrimental.
Let me wrap up this interview by asking you, Mr. Vyas, what are your top 3 priorities that you think policymakers should ensure so that we make the most of this demographic dividend that we enjoy?
Well, the first thing will be to keep demographic dividend or the opportunity in demographics on the table, and that is absent. I have not seen as yet, and I've even asked people whether demographic dividend was any time a part of our planning process at any level in any form of government, and the answer was no. So the first thing to do is to recognize that that's not only for the academics and television debates, but that's a national opportunity, and if you don't see it, it will become a national calamity. So that will be the first thing. The second thing I would say is to tune the education system as a whole and not talk only of skilling. And the third thing would be to focus enormously on the opportunity we have in exploiting our natural resources to building an industrial sector, a strong industrial sector for domestic consumption as much as for exports. And mind you, given that there is a trade uncertainty globally, I will have a lot of focus on increasing domestic consumption as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Vyas, for speaking with us. Some very key, crucial insights, because what we do as a nation in the next 10 years will determine whether this huge population of ours takes us forward or takes us behind. But to make those key policy decisions, it's very important to have stable governance, and politics plays a big part of that. We are now fresh out of a general election where we've seen a resounding mandate for the Bharatiya Janata Party. It's confirmed what we've known for long, that the Indian political landscape has changed, and maybe forever. Is this a phase that will last for the next decade? Are we going to see a continuation of the BJP's domination on the electoral scene? To speak on that, I'm joined now by Swaraj Party founder, but also well-known political analyst Yogendra Yadav. Mr. Yadav, let me begin by asking you, what do you see in the political landscape for the next 10 years?
This is a very critical moment in the history of India because just when we thought we have developed a stable base for democratic order, that is precisely when we have reached a point where the fundamentals of democracy are under challenge, under threat. Just when we thought that we had learned to deal with diversities in a way that could be a lesson for the rest of the world, we turn around and are out to almost dismantle the regime of diversities that we have ourselves promoted. Just when we thought we are safe from any external aggression, we go through this bout of anxious, insecure, jingoist nationalism. Just when we thought we have a secure social order, we are beginning to rethink about it. That, to my mind, is the crucial paradox of our times. That, to my mind, is a real question that needs to be answered. And that the answer to this question, in a sense, holds the key to what we are likely to witness in the next 10 years.
Well, Mr. Yadav, it's tied out to the way people vote. Do you see, standing here right now, the continuance of the BJP's dominant position over the next decade, and we'll be looking at 2 general elections in the next 10 years?
If you were to ask me this question today, any sensible political analyst might say, well, it will continue, because if you look at the strength, the hegemony of the BJP today, and if you look at the complete disarray that the opposition finds itself in, then of course it's very easy to say, yes, BJP dominance is here to stay. But do remember, these things look less fragile than they actually are. No hegemony in the world is perfect. And do remember what the BJP looked like in 2009 after the second defeat. They looked like they were nowhere. So things change in politics. To my mind, the more important thing that we should look for as a country is not so much about which party dominates, which party does not dominate. What we should be looking at is the stability of democratic order. Now, here is the paradox. On the one hand, we have a government which is more secure more stable than any government we have seen in the last 2-3 decades. Big majority, no challenge, virtual dominance throughout the country. So we have a governmental stability. At the same time, some of the foundations of our democratic order are under challenge. The basic idea of freedom of media, free expression, basic democratic regimes like routines like a certain level playing ground in elections, free election commission, free judiciary, all of these things look far more fragile than they looked 15 or 20 years ago. And that is what we should be worried, that is what we should be thinking about as a country, more than which particular party is going to dominate or not, because these things are transient, they come and go.
You know, Mr. Yadav, 10 years is not a long time in politics, and any change like the ones you're talking about to the current situation would be through electoral democracy. In this context, do you think the opposition parties will undergo a churn and a sea change over the next 10 years?
As of today, the opposition has no doctrine, the opposition has no strategy, the opposition has of course no tactics, they don't have a face, they don't have a roadmap. But we are looking at one of the worst moments in the history of Indian opposition. What the opposition needs is a doctrine that responds to this verdict. There are two imperatives of this verdict. On the one hand, this is a clear mandate for one party, almost for one person, Mr. Modi. A mandate has to be respected in democracy. Opposition has not yet learned to respect it. For the last 1 month, what we have witnessed is series of denials, trying to obfuscate the matters, and not quite being able to see through, to be able to even respect the mandate. On the other hand, this mandate brings with it very deep challenges to democratic order, almost to the Republic of India, which has to be resisted. So what the opposition needs is a strategy that combines respecting the mandate and yet resisting the possible onslaught on the foundations of our republic. These are somewhat contrary demands, and it requires enormous imagination on the part of opposition to come up with a doctrine that combines the two. Unless the opposition does so, they are out in the cold. They have no way of coming back. So it's very hard to predict and say, will the opposition find a new doctrine? Will the opposition find a new face? They might not. But unless they do not have a way back, because the BJP today represents one of the most powerful electoral machines. It represents a hegemony which is not merely electoral dominance, but also ideological cultural dominance, which needs to be responded to. At the moment, the opposition simply doesn't have tools to be able to take on that dominance and that hegemony.
Let's also look at it another way when we talk about the political landscape in the next 10 years. Will we see more of a contest between national parties? And that is part of the story with the BJP's huge electoral success, where regional parties in different parts of the country have ceded space. Do you think regional parties will still retain their relevance?
This is too early to write an obituary of the regional parties, because you could also say the only parties that have managed to resist the BJP onslaught are actually the regional parties. So to my mind, the real question is not whether regional parties or the national parties will dominate. The character of our politics is such that any party, in order to survive, has to have regional groundings. It may do so within one label of a national party, or it may acquire the name of different political parties. The Congress party of yesteryears used to be a party which was a national label but with regional groundings. When Congress lost that, it became vulnerable. The BJP is trying to gather regional groundings. So to my mind, in a large, diverse, complex country like India, there is no way of turning one's back to the regions. It's almost like saying, will Europe have one party which would not differ from France to Germany to Sweden to somewhere? That's impossible. We are a very large country. Regional grounding, regional flavor is a must. whether it happens within a large umbrella called a single political party or whether it happens through different regional political parties is something to be seen. But to my mind, regional parties are here to stay for quite some time.
Mr. Yadav, after these elections, liberals or so-called liberals or people who are, brandished as liberals find themselves down and out. People saying that they're out of touch with reality. Do you think that in the social sense, the space that this class of people currently hold will be ceded? They also need to change the way that they're looking at ground realities in India?
At the moment, I find this small section of Indian intelligentsia, but do remember we are talking of a very small section, which is you could describe it as liberal. Sometimes ironically the same people are also called left, liberal, left, progressive, secular. I mean, they all fuse into one. The problem is that this group is not only small, this is so much at distance from ordinary people. I had once compared them, the Indian intelligentsia, the Indian liberal, progressive, secular intelligentsia, a group to which in a sense I empathize with, I relate to, I in a sense kind of belong to it. I had compared them to the Russian elite of the 19th century, the French speaking Russian elite. They spoke French to each other and they did not understand what these Russian peasants were all about. Almost something similar is happening to our country. You could also compare them to the American liberal elite, which is aghast at the sight of Mr. Trump, who cannot see Mr. Trump. At the same time, they cannot understand why someone like Mr. Trump has come up. The relationship of Indian liberal elite to Mr. Modi is somewhat similar. So what needs to change is that this elite needs to change. We must begin by recognizing that something is wrong with us, not merely with the voter. To say that something is wrong with the voter, something is wrong with Mr. Modi is not beginning to get the reality. Something is wrong with us and the way we looked at the world. We need to change. And what needs to change to my mind are three things. One, we have been indifferent to nationalism. Nationalism matters, national security matters. We need to draw upon the legacy of our nationalism in a positive way. Number two, we have been indifferent to our languages and cultures. Very few Indian liberal elite in fact deal with any of the Indian languages. And number three, we have been rather illiterate and unaware of and therefore contemptuous of religions, including Hinduism. These need to change. Our liberal elite, our intellectuals need to go back and relate to this society. Unless we do so, we would constantly be surprised the way we have been so. So, to my mind, here is a moment which calls for introspection. Here is a moment that calls for radical rethinking. I do hope it happens, and if it does, India has a much better future to look forward to.
You're talking about advice to liberals, which sometimes I feel is a Twitter or a social media creation. But Mr. Yadav, what about what opposition parties or non-BJP parties are going to do for the next 10 years? Do you think that they will imitate the formula that has worked for the BJP, whether it's nationalism or majoritarianism, and we'll see a lot more and many versions of that in the next 10 years?
Unless the opposition can come up with a new doctrine for itself, they have no option except to imitate the BJP, because it's a standard logic of democratic politics. What the BJP has done is that it has shifted the entire spectrum of public opinion to the right. Therefore, the midpoint of public opinion has shifted to the right. And it is in the nature of democratic politics that it drifts towards the midpoint. So, if the midpoint is Hindutva, you would expect Congress to imitate and become a soft Hindutva party. That's what happens, unless they can come up with a new doctrine. And that new doctrine need not be invented from thin air. All we need to do is to go back to the tradition of our freedom struggle. Our freedom struggle gave us a nationalism, which is not a negative nationalism of the European kind. It's not jingoism. It's a positive, healthy nationalism about unity in diversity. We need to go back to the tradition where all our major thinkers and intellectuals read in English and all other languages, but they wrote in their own languages. We need to go back to the tradition of Mahatma Gandhi, who called himself a Sanatani Hindu and had the courage to stand up and oppose any kind of communal violence. These are traditions we need to go back to. What we need is a new doctrine for the 21st century. If we don't come up with that, then of course every party would imitate the leader. And of course, when you imitate, you don't do it very well. When you imitate, you are second rate and you fail. So that, to my mind, is the larger scenario. For 21st century, we need a new ideology, which we have lost.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Yogendra Yadav, for speaking with us. So we've brought you this evening, as we celebrate our 10th anniversary, a look ahead at the next 10 years, whether it's on economy, industry, the demographic dividend, or the political landscape. We hope you've enjoyed the show we've put together for you, and we'll see you back tomorrow at 9 p.m. on the India Development Debate. Keep watching ET Now.